Bonjour, hello, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon for this roundtable on Canada and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. My name is Daniel Bélan, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. I want to note, because we begin today's lecture, that it's being recorded, and that keep your microphones muted in order to avoid any interruptions. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box. There will be a moderated Q&A period following the panel discussion. And of course, you are welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, or MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events, such as today's panel on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. Thank you all for joining us today for this panel featuring Canadian perspectives on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The 4% of Canadians of Ukrainian descent have been especially alarmed by the situation in Ukraine, and we hope that this panel will give them a voice and also help us explore the historical, political, and social ties between Canada and Ukraine, as well as the role of Canadian foreign policy, especially the ongoing sanction against Russia in the current conflict. We'll also, of course, discuss the situation on the ground in Ukraine in the aftermath of the Russian invasion. I would like to introduce our panelists in advance, and I want to thank them first, of course, for joining us today for this discussion on a very important topic. Dominique Arel is professor of political science and chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa. He received a BA from the University of Montreal, master's degree from McGill University, and a PhD from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Arel's interests range from nationalism and language politics to the politics of identity and the censuses. He has a book forthcoming at Cambridge University Press on the Donbass war, pre-Russian invasion, of course. Daria Glazkova is currently an MA candidate at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Monk School of Global Affairs. Daria holds a BA from the University of Toronto and from Odessa Mechnikov National University. Daria's research interests include urban history and studies of ethnic and national identities. Daria's current research is focused on decommunization of urban space in the city of Odessa. Juliet Johnson, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University, has research focusing on the politics of money and identity, particularly in post-communist Europe. She's an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and network director of the Jean Monnet network between the EU and Russia. Next, we have Anastasia Leshchyshyn, who's a PhD student at McGill University in the Department of Political Science. She holds an MA in European and Russian Affairs from the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and a BA in History, Political Science, and Classical Civilization, also at the U of T. She was formerly a research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, in the division dedicated to the study of the Holodomor, the man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine of 1932-1933. David Marples is a distinguished university professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta. He is the author of 16 single-authored books, including Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine in Conflict, Our Glorious Past, and also Heroes and Villains. So we will actually start the discussion with David Marples. So I will ask you several questions, and then I will do that with all the panelists before we move to the general discussion, and we'll take questions from the audience. So hello, David.
Hi there.
So as an historian who has written extensively about Ukraine, including the conflict in the Donbass region, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine something you had anticipated, or were you surprised by Putin's aggression?
Well, my answer to that is rather ambivalent in that I did write a paper which predicted that Putin would invade Ukraine. But at the same time, I didn't imagine an invasion on this scale. I thought it would be a more partial invasion, perhaps, to occupy fully the two regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and to capture the city, the port of Mariupol. But I did not anticipate the kind of invasion that's taken place that has hit virtually all regions of Ukraine and all the major cities.
So what are the main historical factors that are really essential to understand what's going on in Ukraine right now, to understand the Russian invasion and the resistance of the Ukrainian people against it?
I think it's on two fronts. There's a broad international front whereby the expansion of NATO gradually since 1999 and particularly in 2004 has concerned Russia, and Russia's made evident that concern in the past. In 2008, a membership action plan was offered to Ukraine and Georgia, and this resulted ultimately in an invasion of Georgia by Russian forces, with Georgia trying to stop two breakaway regions from becoming independent. In 2014, the uprising known as Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, centered in Kiev, saw a series of demonstrations against Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, after he refused an association agreement with the European Union. And this resulted ultimately in the departure of Yanukovych as president and the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the war in the Donbass that was fomented by separatist forces under Russian command and with Russian material and weapons. So this is the kind of background, I think. It's hard to say whether there's a specific cause to this war. There doesn't seem to be anything immediately that you could point to as why it happened now, rather than say 8 years ago or even 18 years ago when the Baltic states joined NATO and NATO came to the Russian border.
So let's talk a bit about Belarus, because you have written extensively about that country. And the regime is supporting the Kremlin in its invasion of Ukraine. How can we understand the support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine from Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko and the country's armed forces?
Well, first of all, I would say that we have to go back to the election of 2020 in Belarus on August the 9th, which Lukashenko quite clearly lost, and then clamped down on the opposition using his security forces. Many of the oppositionists ended up in jail, many fled abroad, and Lukashenko was left in power with the firm backing of Russia. Russia was the only real ally at that time, and Russia has remained the only ally. It's the most important economic partner of Belarus. So when we say Belarus today, we're really talking about the rump group that retained power illegally, and not the Belarusian people who've always had a pretty good relationship with Ukrainians, and some of which have already fought and died in this cause for Ukraine. I think the situation now is that Lukashenko doesn't really have any individual initiatives of his own. He's simply following orders from Russia. At the moment, missiles were fired from Belarusian territory into Ukraine, but the Belarusian army itself, even though it was engaged in exercises with the Russians prior to the invasion, has not crossed the border yet. It may well do so, but it's not done so now. But Belarus economically now is facing severe problems. Many of the companies that pulled out of Russia in recent days have also pulled out of Belarus. Places like IKEA, DHL, FedEx, the Danish company Maersk, the World Bank suspended all programs in Belarus. The credit rating of Belarus has gone down to junk level. The ruble's collapsed in Belarus, and sanctions have followed today and yesterday from the European Union, Canada, United States, and others. So Belarus is going to suffer for this, and Lukashenko really maybe has been pushed in this direction, but I don't think there's any way out of it for him. And if Russia fails in this mission, this would be the end of Lukashenko as well. It may well be the end anyway, but that would guarantee that it's a certainty. So Belarus is a partner with Russia in this, but only on the official level.
Thank you, David. We'll move to Dominique. Bonjour, Dominique.
Bonjour.
So I have a few questions for you about the topic that you know well, Ukrainian identity. You've written extensively about that topic, about language in Ukraine, the issue of language. And I have a question about Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian identity and how they shape the mobilization against the Russian invasion on the ground concretely.
Yeah, there's been a long time debate in the field on Ukrainian national identity. And I know David has been part of that debate and post-independence. This idea that nationalism, the degree of organization, mobilization was much more intense in the western part of the country historically, in Kiev eventually, than in the east. So there was this this idea that nation building, this idea that the degree of cohesion as a national identity for residents of Ukraine, of identifying with the nation, with the state, was kind of incomplete, was still like in process in the 90s, in the 2000s. Well, in the catastrophe that we're witnessing, one thing we could say is that the cauldron of this war of aggression is having the effect of, quote unquote, completing nation building in Ukraine, in a sense that it's, as you said, all of Ukraine. David said that, he didn't expect an invasion in all of Ukraine, but it's particularly eastern Ukraine that's being bombed. Mariupol is actually in Donbass. It's a city as Russian speaking, and even in terms of ethnic Russians in the last census, which was taken quite a while ago, could be as, again, culturally Russian, that Donetsk could ever been. And yet this is the city that is being bombed and, indiscriminately. And it has the effect, and we're seeing that in the occupied areas and in the south, in Kherson, of Russian-speaking Ukrainians coming out with the flag and basically telling the soldiers, go home with your Russian world. Russian world is this construction of Putin that basically, if you speak Russian, you're part of Russia. So that is quite striking.
And to bounce back on your last remark about the language, there are, of course, a lot of Ukrainians, especially out east, who have Russian as their mother tongue. That's actually the case also of President Zelensky. What's the role of language in that conflict, symbolically, but also even at the operational level? The fact, for example, that Ukrainian protesters can speak directly to Russian invaders in their language, or President Zelensky can also speak directly to Russians, although this is, of course, hard to reach Russians at home because of censorship. But language seems to be a major aspect of this, the situation on the ground. So can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, well, the first thing to understand for people who may not be familiar with the language landscape, let's say in Ukraine, is that for residents of Ukraine, everybody is bilingual. Everybody understands the other language. Now, the more east you go, the more people are a little more comfortable to actively speak Russian rather than Ukrainian. That doesn't mean that they can't speak Ukrainian. Of course they can. And the key is the relationship they have to the language itself. There's certainly no hostility among Russian speakers towards the Ukrainian language. And the more you go west, it's the other way around, right? So it's been, language politics, and here we're in Quebec, and the language politics can be intense. But right now, in Ukraine itself, it's a total non-issue. And it's very well symbolized, you mentioned it. Zelensky was raised as a Russian speaker. He didn't speak much Ukrainian. Again, he understood it, of course. He grew up in Dnipropetrovsk province. I think, is he from Kryvyi Rih or Dniprodzerzhinsk, Kryvyi Rih, I think. Anyway, one of the, not the main regional town, city. So and his famous show was, he did it in Russian, the one on Netflix, like Servant of the People. Then he becomes president, and of course he has to use Ukrainian more and more. And now that's the only language he's using, unless he's addressing people in Russia. Then he switches because he symbolizes the state. And now for Putin, he's seen as some kind of, it's so absurd and obscene, Nazi, right? Nationalist, etc. He's an Eastern Ukrainian. He's a Russian speaker. He's not from Galicia, again, Galicia being Western Ukraine from the point of view, again, of Russia, of Putin. He's an Easterner. But again, language in terms of, if it symbolizes the state, then it's Ukrainian. Everything is Ukrainian now. But at ground level, you've got these demonstrations in Kherson, Melitopol, very brave people. They're Russian speakers. It doesn't matter. I mean, they're basically defending their home, and it's Ukraine.
So obviously there are strong ties between historical ties between Ukraine and Russia. How is this reality affecting the situation on the ground in the context of the ongoing Russian aggression?
I mean, the war is historic in the wrong sense of the term, and the first war of aggression in Europe since World War II, and the Ukrainian cities haven't been bombed, or Kiev, since 1944. I mean, it's all historic. But as I said, in practice, Russia is actually, right now, much of the military carnage is taking place in Eastern Ukraine. So we have the situation when Russia is attacking the people that supposedly they come to defend from the quote unquote nationalists and fascists. And I think it is breaking very, very deep bonds, historical, religious, linguistic, cultural, political, memorial, you name it, between Ukrainians. And when I say Ukrainians here, it's not in an ethnic sense, people in Ukraine. You have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate that is currently undergoing a rebellion. Why? Because Russia is bombing even its churches. There was a monastery in Donetsk, the part of Donetsk that was under Ukrainian control in Svyatogorsk. This is where we are. I mean, that will take a long, long time, if not generations, to restore. Again, this obsession by Putin that we're the same people, Ukrainians and Russians, the same people, we just have to get rid of the nationalists. The opposite effect of this terrible war is actually to break the links between Russia and Ukraine. And there was even a survey last week. 80% of the population think that it would take at least 10 years, if not 20, and 40+% said never, of restoring links. We're talking just links with Russia. There's something very, very profound happening right now.
Thank you. Yes, so completion of a nation-building process that started a long time ago, it seems. Thank you very much for your answers, Dominique. Juliet, hello, Juliet.
Hello.
So your first book is titled A Fistful of Rubles, The Rise and Fall of the Russian Banking System. And so you know a lot about Russia, and currently, of course, Russia's banking system and economy are facing major challenges, partly because of the sanctions imposed by Canada and many other countries. What are these sanctions, and what role Canada has played in working with our allies to coordinate the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I'll have to say that the speed, the scope, and the level of international participation we've seen in sanctioning a major world economy is truly stunning, right? Most importantly, from my perspective, and of course, and that's the financial perspective, Canada, the US, EU countries, Switzerland, and other democratic governments have cut off the central bank of Russia's access to nearly half of its 630 billion in international reserves. And for those that might not get why this is such a big deal, think about without these reserves, the central bank can't easily provide the government or businesses with the foreign currency it needs. They need to pay international obligations, and they can't also easily defend the value of the ruble. So what this means is that the exchange rate of the ruble against major currencies falls, and the central bank can't do as much about it, and inflation will rise. Now, importantly here, the Canadian government, especially Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, played an extremely important role in pushing its allies in the US and Europe to impose these sanctions on the central bank. But beyond the central bank, we see coordinated sanctions that have involved banning major Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system, imposing a lot of targeted financial sanctions or travel bans on a wide range of individuals associated with the Russian government, as well as many non-financial sanctions such as tariffs on Russian goods, selected export bans, bans on transactions with most Russian state-owned companies, things like that. But on top of this, we've seen, and again, perhaps unexpectedly, this rapid and massive exodus of private companies from Russia as well. So for example, on the financial front, Visa and MasterCards issued in Russia will no longer work internationally, and internationally issued Visas and MasterCards won't work in Russia. Even companies with a longstanding Russian presence, like David had mentioned, IKEA, have left the Russian market. And I'm gonna paste something into the chat right now. According to this regularly updated list, here we go. There, I think you can get it. This is great, by maintained by Yale professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. Nearly 400 companies have left the Russian market, and again, over the last 3 weeks. And there's an even harsher range of economic sanctions that could be imposed, which the Canadian government, among others, is considering. But the ones that have already been imposed, again, sweeping and really on an economy of this size, quite unprecedented.
So would you say that these sanctions are starting to work to have a concrete political effect on the ground in Russia?
Oh, political, well, gets a little bit into your next question, because the question is, are the sanctions working? And it very much depends on what you mean by working. Mm-hmm. What are the goals of the sanctions? So let me start with the narrow definition of working. Are the sanctions causing significant economic pain to the Russian government? Because again, I think your next question gets at the broader meaning. Can the sanctions actually change the behavior of the Russian government, or even lead potentially to Putin's overthrow? So if we just look at the narrow question of, does the Russian government feel the pain? Absolutely. And again, I'll just say a few things about the financial end of the pain, but there's much more. Before the war, the Russian government had built what many people in the financial business had referred to as Fortress Russia, as they had learned from the experiences after their invasion of Crimea in 2014. And they worked pretty hard to try to sanctions-proof the Russian economy. The main thing was to build up this vast war chest of international reserves, but they also tried to diversify the reserves away from the US dollar, introduced a Russian cards payment system that would be at least a partial alternative to SWIFT. And all these have made the Russian government fairly confident that it could weather any likely financial sector sanctions. But again, they didn't anticipate the size and the scope the speed of the sanctions that have been placed. And so what we see, primarily because the central bank can't access nearly half of its reserve funds, and also remember that another third is in physical gold. It's actually very difficult to monetize quickly. The central bank is running out of money, and there's a market panic. So what we see is the crash in the ruble exchange rate. The ruble exchange rate was about 75 rubles to the US dollar at the start of the year. It's dipped as low as 130 rubles to the dollar since the war started. Inflation was up 2.2% in the first full week after the war. That's 2.2% in a week. And so annual inflation is going to be at least 20%, probably more. You're also going to see, forecasted the Russian GDP dropping by at least 20% in 2022, when prior to the war growth was expected. And again, the central bank has very much been scrambling to try to make up for this. The interest rate has more than doubled to 20%. There are all sorts of limitations now on people taking foreign exchange out of the country. So Russians, for example, Russian citizens can't withdraw more than $10,000 from their foreign exchange deposits for the next 6 months. And no one can buy dollars with rubles from banks within Russia for the next 6 months. The stock exchange is closed, and it closed on February 25th, and it hasn't been opened back up. Russian government has blocked interest payments to foreign investors. And perhaps most interestingly, right, Russia said that it will pay its foreign currency sovereign debt payments in rubles instead of dollars or euros for creditors who are located in unfriendly countries. And that's pretty much every country right now, with a few exceptions. So there's an imminent risk. And when I mean imminent, I'm talking about in a few days of sovereign default by the Russian government. So in essence, Fortress Russia has been breached, and for all intents and purposes, the ruble is no longer a convertible currency. These sanctions are hitting very hard.
So let's talk about the prospect of political change in Russia in the aftermath of these sanctions and the decision of many Western businesses to leave Russia. It's of course hard to tell. I don't want you to predict the future, but what's your take on the political situation in Russia and the stability or not of the Putin regime?
Mm-hmm. Well, when people talk about the stability of the regime and say, all right, will there be regime change here because of this, from the Russian perspective, right, colossal mistake, to give it the kindest possible word, of invading Ukraine and showing the ineptitude of the Russian military and uniting practically the entire world against it. So there are two ways people talk about this. First, will there be popular uprisings that can overthrow the regime? This people agree that this seems quite unlikely. Even though there is a lot of economic pain for individual Russians, and I can talk about that in more detail. I mean, everyday Russians' lives have changed quite significantly. And even though you've seen a lot of individual acts of defiance and bravery, it's quite unlikely that everyday Russians will rise up en masse and overthrow the Putin government. Right? There are now serious consequences in terms of jail time and fines for even saying that this is a war, much less for actively protesting it. And the Russian government has also progressively been cutting people off from non-official information sources. So really, the average Russian has a much different perspective on the war than people in most of the rest of the world. Now, if we look about the possibility of regime change from above, right, will there be a palace coup? Again, we don't know what's going on within the Russian government. We can only talk in terms of speculation. On the one hand, it's true that nearly all of the officials that Putin has made wealthy through his corrupt regime stand to lose a great deal from these sanctions. They already are. But what we have to consider is that in order for a coup to be successful, first of all, you need, remember, his bases are in the security services, and so you would need the security services to be complicit in overthrowing him. for a variety of reasons I'm happy to get into in the Q&A, that seems unlikely. And you also need elites to engage in collective action to do this. And again, the bar for that is quite high. So in sum, I unfortunately don't think it's likely for sanctions to lead to regime change, but what they can do, it's more limited, but it's very important. And what they can do is they can make it more difficult for Russia to pursue its military goals in Ukraine, especially over the long term, because war is expensive and sanctions make it that much more difficult for Russia to afford it.
Thank you very much, Juliet. It's very helpful. We'll now turn to Anastasia. Hello, Anastasia.
Hello.
Hello. So you're welcome. You're a McGill grad student of Ukrainian descent, Canadian of Ukrainian descent. 4% of Canadians are of Ukrainian descent, approximately. This is not something that strong demographically, for example, here in Quebec, but in the prairies, it's close to 15% of the population in Manitoba, for example. How have these Canadians of Ukrainian descent, reacted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
No, thank you. So in order to begin answering this question, and because I'm responding within this forum, I want to briefly outline sort of who these Ukrainian Canadians are. As with many diasporas, the Ukrainians in Canada, they're not monolithic. The Ukrainian Canadian experience is broad. There's certainly no singular sort of shared reality among Ukrainian Canadians. And each Ukrainian immigration wave that came to Canada sort of came under quite different circumstances. And I just want to quickly outline sort of there are sort of 5 major waves that have been delineated. Scholars are now beginning to speak about a sixth. And again, this will play into the answer of how Ukrainian Canadians are broadly responding to the current conflict. So the first wave so it was in the early 1890s to 1914. There was a massive immigration of ethnic Ukrainians, mostly who were coming from Ukrainian inhabited lands in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they were predominantly from the province of Galicia and Bukovina. Canada, there was a significant land shortage at the time. Canada actually started advertising in these provinces that there was land available in Canada. And then so many Ukrainians responded to this. And as you said, many settled in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Others at the same time, I note, were also going to the United States. The second wave was in the interwar period. Many of these were also laborers in various industries, and they had been caught as minorities amid the partitioning of the region in the interwar period. Then the third wave was from 1946 to 61. It was in the post-war period, and these were largely immigrants and refugees from all parts of Ukraine. So notably here, we suddenly had individuals coming from Eastern Ukraine, whereas before that, the Ukrainian Canadian community was largely from Western Ukraine, and most of these people were educated professionals and intellectuals, and many had then settled in urban areas. So suddenly there was a growing demographic of the Ukrainian Canadian community. So my grandparents were part of this migration. They had initially been in displaced persons camps in Germany. They eventually settled in the United Kingdom, where both pairs of my grandparents married. Then finally settled in Toronto in the early 1950s, where my parents were born. And I do want to mention that prior to their immigration, some of my grandparents actually lived in the town of Przemyśl, the small city in Poland on the border with Ukraine that's now receiving a lot of attention because it served as the main checkpoint for Ukrainian refugees entering into Poland. Then there was a fourth wave of people largely in the 1980s from the Eastern Bloc. And of course, the fifth wave was then beginning with Ukraine's independence. So there was a sort of 4-decade almost aside from the fourth wave gap between the immigrants who came in the post-war period and those who came in independent Ukraine. And so the reason I wanted to emphasize this, and I wanted to in particular focus on The first three waves, because over the course of these waves, Ukrainians established distinct community structures in Canada, also in the US, and many of them still exist to this day. So they were, focused on secular organizations that provided insurance for Ukrainians. They also established sort of cultural organizations with cultural events, publication of Ukrainian language, newspapers, schools, dancing troupes. Churches were also very central to Ukrainian Canadian life. But the main thing that I'm getting to is here that a central part of sort of the Ukrainian nationality building process in Canada and in North America more broadly was sort of an ongoing and quite active interest in their European homeland. And so over the years and over the decades, Ukrainian immigrants and their descendants really maintained and wanted to maintain influence, economic influence, but in particular wanted to have their say in political developments in Ukraine. And so in particular in the 4 decades from, so I should say that already in the 1930s, Ukrainians in Canada were lobbying the Canadian government and trying to raise the attention of the famine, the man-made famine that was happening in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s. So there's been sort of, we're almost at a century of lobbying among Ukrainian Canadians about issues in the homeland. And also my final point on this is that despite the various numerous internal conflicts within the Ukrainian community, within the diaspora, they were very successful in maintaining all of the elements of the Ukrainian of Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian cultural patrimony that in Soviet times were being suppressed. So at the same time that these communities were flourishing, the Soviet regime was denying the validity of certain aspects of Ukrainian culture. They were outlawing Ukrainian churches and religious orders, suppressing information about certain historical events, sort of banning the promotion of notions of an independent Ukrainian statehood. So this is all to say that the kind of activism that we see now is not new and is really part of a long-standing interest among the Ukrainian diaspora, broadly speaking, in events in their homeland.
Thank you, fascinating. You're a university student. We've seen protests on campuses across the country, including at McGill, in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what have university students and other people on Canadian campuses done to mobilize in support of Ukraine in these difficult times?
Before I answer sort of that, I also want to give a context that sort of universities in Canada and in the United States had played a significant role in promoting knowledge about Ukraine, about the Ukrainian language, about Ukrainian Canadians sort of decades before Ukraine had gained independence. So among these were the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which was established in 1976. And so for years, and I bring up the idea of the famine again. So the Soviets denied the existence of this famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. Many Ukrainians believed this was a deliberate policy sort of employed against the Ukrainian nation. And so in the diaspora and among these Canadian and Western institutions, they were studying and promoting the study of a phenomenon that was being entirely denied within the Soviet Union. And so in saying that, once Ukraine became independent, and even before then, suddenly scholars were able to establish very meaningful networks with Ukrainian scholars to bring Ukrainian scholars into the broader international academic sphere. And so that is all to say that there are very strong connections with Ukrainian scholars, yes, and I know many. Where was I? Yes, sorry, now I'm going back to the question, how have they mobilized? That is all to say that there are very strong connections with Ukrainian scholars and institutions. And I know that throughout Europe, I have seen various Scholars at Risks programs that have been implemented. A number of Ukrainian universities have been reaching out to the international community, hoping to establish various internship programs or some sort of exchange programs in order to ensure that that their students will be able to continue their studies. I know here in Canada, people are also working, or at least universities are working on the information front. They want to make sure that Canadians and academics have access to accurate information and historical context on the conflict, aside from the numerous conferences and programs that people have been holding, such as this one. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in particular has been releasing various sort of short clips that respond to particular questions related to the conflict, something even as simple as, are Russians and Ukrainians the same people? Is the Ukrainian language the same as the Russian language? Is the war in Ukraine a result of ethnic conflict? And it goes on, and I encourage our viewers to visit this site as well.
Thank you. So last question for you. What have you been hearing from scholars in Ukraine? How have these scholars responded to the war? How have they been affected by it?
So most of my communication with scholars in Ukraine, even before the outbreak of war, has been through Facebook. I just want to note that sort of Facebook in Ukraine, or at least among Ukrainian scholars, is largely, it's not only a social venue, it's also very much similar to a professional one, similar to our LinkedIn. So it's through there that I've, over the last 2 weeks, frankly, been entirely absorbed in the kind of posts that I've been seeing, which relate to sort of simple things, people calling out, wanting to leave, or asking for routes, asking for places to stay, announcing various institutions and even families who are prepared to accept refugees. I want to say I've been corresponding with one scholar in Kharkiv, who she's an oral historian, and she's sent me lengthy messages about how her first few days in Kharkiv, and I just want to sort of read a part of it to give an example of what these people are going through. So she's a scholar of the Second World War, of the Chernobyl tragedy, and she's interviewed various people over the years. And she says, in the first few days after the conflict began, I was completely intellectually paralyzed, unable to say or write anything. It was something apocalyptic. All my dear interviewees, whom I've interviewed over the years, who told me about the Holocaust, who survived the World War, the horrors of war, they all came to my mind as reality. It was as if all this knowledge that I thought was in the past was now happening to me here in the present. So, you know, these scholars are in the midst of experiencing these horrors of war. I think some of them are trying to almost already kind of intellectually try and process the events that are going on around them. But broadly speaking, there has been wide support that I have seen from various, even Ukrainian scholars in universities throughout Europe, who are sharing information about the kind of resources that their institutions are able to provide, both to accommodate students and professors, and also to facilitate their ongoing academic pursuits.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. Very, very helpful. Daria, welcome.
Thank you.
You are a Ukrainian born and raised, a grad student currently living in Canada, and many of your family members are still in Odessa. Could you please tell us about the life in Odessa right now under this Russian invasion?
Yes, I'm in contact with my family and friends in Odessa. Many people have stayed, and so far it has been more quiet in Odessa than in other cities. Odessa is in the south of Ukraine. It's also a Russian-speaking city. It has a seaport, so it's quite a vulnerable area. And there are air alarms and explosions heard in Odessa already. And people joke that no one could imagine less than a month ago that a phrase, "this is just our anti-aircraft warfare working," would be bringing relief. But people in Odessa know that it is because of Mykolaiv Oblast, which keeps fighting, keeps pushing the occupiers away, and keeps standing, that Odessa is quiet now and there are no battles, on-ground battles in Odessa, and everyone is praying for Mykolaiv. It's really difficult there. And at the moment in Odessa, some grocery stores and pharmacies are open and people can get food and some supplies. And there is public transportation running. And many people have chosen to stay in Odessa so far. Some have, of course, left. And for the future, in the next few days, according to Oleksiy Danilov, who's the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council in Ukraine, Russia plans to land troops in Odessa Oblast. And Danilov says that the Russian military planned to do this several days ago, but the weather persuaded them against this, and they went to the Russian-occupied Crimea. But he says that they're coming back, but Ukraine is ready to fight. And according to one Russian prisoner of war, there's a recording of him testifying that 600 troops that were supposed to land in Odessa refused to do so and rebelled against their officers. So there's that maybe not quite yet confirmed information. But here, this is the situation in Odessa at the moment.
Thank you. Beyond Odessa per se, so how are Ukrainians organizing to cope with and resist the Russian invasion and fight back?
I might talk more about Odessa because this is the voices on the ground that I hear more, but this is true for other cities from what I see in the media as well. Some people are just staying in cities and keep working, which is already a form of fighting back. And for example, my best friend is an oncologist and she's staying at the hospital in Odessa, and she says that some of the hospital staff has left, but those who stayed are very helpful and support each other in all the ways. She keeps giving chemotherapy treatment to the patients and moves those who are immobile to the basement during air alarms. And also many medical students from Odessa went to Kyiv region to help with the wounded and to other regions where situation is more difficult at the moment. So some of the other people I know and people in various Ukrainian cities have become volunteers, and they deliver protective gear, medications, food to our military divisions in different regions. And of course, many people have joined the army and territorial defense, both men and women from what I see. There's also another form of people's resistance. So there was a claim that the head of the Odessa regional administration, Serhiy Hrinevetsky, collaborated with Russia and did not distribute supplies and ammunition to our military divisions in Odessa. And people started calling for his removal on social media and appealed to the MPs, local MPs in Ukraine. And by the order of President Zelensky, Hrinevetsky was removed from the position, and the new head of the regional administration, Maxim Marchenko, was ordered to become the head of the regional administration in Odessa. And now the city is doing a lot better with supplies and ammunition. So one creative way that it just came to mind of defense, again, Odessa Theater, musical comedy theater, have called themselves as to extend the territorial defense, which is all the volunteers who joined to take arms in their hands and defend the country. They call themselves theater defense and do whatever they can to help. For example, they're preparing masking nets. They also wrote to various theaters in Russia, stating that there is war and calling for their support. It's one of the ways how people of a profession organized to work together and found a community which is close to them.
Thank you. Obviously, the Ukrainian response in terms of the military, but ordinary people as well, has been really strong. And that leads to my last question to you at this time about whether Vladimir Putin and his advisors, whether they miscalculated the Ukrainian resolve when they decided to invade your country.
Yeah, it seems that there are so many media sources which are saying President Biden saying that Putin has terribly miscalculated when he invaded Ukraine, and miscalculated in terms of how Ukraine was prepared in terms of the army, the military, the training. Also, it seems that media sources are saying that no one in the Russian government expected such harsh economic sanctions, and the fact that companies would be just exiting Russian market. But I think it is very important to acknowledge that Putin seems to have terribly miscalculated the identity part of Ukraine. It seems that he was really delusional and indeed believed that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, which is absurd. He did not understand Ukrainians. He did not understand how much unity there would be, how much resistance how resistant Ukrainians would be. So I believe he terribly miscalculated, and on all fronts. And in terms of the identity and resistance, in the last over 20 years of independence, 30 years by now of independence of Ukraine, Ukrainians have reclaimed a lot of their history, relearned a lot of their history. And I went through middle school, through high school in Ukraine, and it seems that at the moment, history of Ukraine lessons are taught on a pretty good level. And that's thankfully to diaspora, and going back to Anastasia's point, how much diaspora Ukrainians have established Ukrainian studies in Canada, in the US, and never forgot the real history, which was suppressed during the Soviet Union time, and brought this real history back to independent Ukraine. And this aspect is extremely important.
Thank you, Daria. This points again to the role of universities in the world in general, in public affairs, and even in this ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Ukrainian resistance against it.